ends. Civil War ends, right? The Republican Party is in control of the government. The Republican Party is going to control the government up until World War I. They are the party that ends slavery. They are the party of civil rights. The Democrats are basically the party of white supremacy, the Ku Klux Klan, the folks that create the society in the South that you might be familiar with, separate drinking fountains, segregated schools, that whole thing. You have a civil war in which the Union, the United States, wins. There are 11 southern states that separate, form the Confederacy. They fight a war. Confederacy loses. Basically, they fight this war over slavery. And the Union Army, the Army of the North, right, of the United States government, occupies the South. So the war ends in April 1865. It lasted for 4 years. Before the war ends, special field order given out by a general named William Tecumseh Sherman. Right, he invaded and occupied Atlanta, East Point, College Park, Decatur, the ATL. All these former slaves said land. They wanted land, their own land, right? Which was really a promise, like an American part of the American dream back then. Jefferson used to talk about it, the idea of an agrarian republic, of everybody having their own piece of land, right? The Republicans had supported what's called the Homestead Act, where people could move out west, and if you took over a piece of land, like 100 acres, and you lived there for a few years and worked it, you would own it outright. And at the time, you have all these slaves. Many of them had worked on plantations, these massive plantations, right? Thousands of acres. And the plantation owners, the slave owners, had left because many of them were in the Confederate government, in the Confederate military, loyal to the Confederate cause. And so when the Union Army showed up, they took off. And slaves basically started occupying the land and working it themselves. Right, because they need to live. They're not going to run away. They have no reason to run from the Union Army. So they start occupying the land and working it themselves. Sherman, this guy general, agrees with that concept. Right, wants to punish the South, wants to punish these wealthy slave owners, and so he issues this thing called Special Field Order 15, which takes land in South Carolina, a place called the Sea Islands. It takes this land that had belonged to wealthy slave owners and redistributes it amongst the slaves that had been there. Right, amongst former slaves. Has anybody heard of the expression 40 acres and a mule? 40 acres and a mule, right? There was this idea that slaves got 40 acres and a mule. They did not. It comes from this. For a time, there are some slaves that got some land, right? There was a time where this idea was promoted, but so that's kind of important. Slaves are clearly establishing, well, we want land. One of the reasons they want land is they kind of want to be left alone, right? They want to have their own piece of land where they're not under the direct supervision of white Southerners, because that's been going on for a very long time, and it's been a very violent system, right? Basically, working land as slaves, you have a white overseer who is physically abusive. There is sexual abuse that is rampant. That's mid-January. January 31st, the 13th Amendment passes. The 13th Amendment, which ends slavery. Does anybody know there's something that Lincoln wrote as president, an executive order prior to this that kind of ended freed slaves, but not really? The Emancipation Proclamation. One of the ways that the United States justified freeing slaves, taking slaves during the war, basically, giving them their freedom in some ways, or if slaves already escaped and gained their own freedom and came to the Union lines, one of the ways they were able to justify this was military expedients, right? The South, the Confederacy, was using slaves to dig trenches, to build railroads. They were using them for the war effort. There is a lot of stuff, and there might still be something on Wikipedia that says 65,000 slaves fought for the Confederate Army. That's not true. Once again, there's a whole movement on the internet that tries to claim that blacks in massive numbers, slaves in massive numbers, fought for the Confederate States of America. It's not true. It did not happen. 65. I mean, there were some that were maybe Creole, mixed Indian, white, black, that ended up fighting, and the South was on the verge of approving arming slaves because they were so desperate near the end, but it never happened. Right? The Union Army did arm slaves. The Union Army in the Emancipation Proclamation said, if slaves come to the Union lines, we will, and they want to be trained as soldiers and go fight, we will arm them and we will let them do that. That was a pretty big deal, the idea of taking these slaves who had lived in a society where it was illegal in many cases for them to own guns. It was illegal for them to learn how to read, right? Training them as soldiers and sending them into the South to actually go shoot at white people. So the 13th Amendment is passed so that it's in the Constitution, slavery is outlawed, right? This isn't something we did during the Civil War. In order to ensure that this is gone, they passed the 13th. Shortly before the war ends, there is an organization set up called the Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency which is going to be active in the former Confederacy in these states and lead the transition or mediate the transition between whites and blacks in this new society, right? There was a society where pretty much if you were black, you were a slave. Slavery was identified with being black. They were synonymous. And as a result, there's this whole socially constructed idea of race, right? Where whites are superior, blacks aren't, they're not as smart, they're not as capable, stuff, all of these things, all these really negative stereotypes, right? And people believe these things, right? And people were used to having a situation where black people in the South were owned by somebody, could be physically abused, sexually abused by somebody, and they had no legal rights whatsoever, right? And all of a sudden, that ends, right? They can leave a plantation if they don't like it. They're not running away. They're not a runaway slave. They're just leaving. They can legally get married, right? They can eventually start to vote. They can go to school. So they're going to have to work for wages. In most instances, a lot of these wealthy slave owners throughout the South retain their land. They're going to be still on the land. So slaves are going to end up having to deal with them, working on their land, negotiating some sort of contract for wages or something, as opposed to just being slaves, right? And the Freedmen's Bureau is going to deal with all of that, right? If a former slave is working on a field of a former slave owner and the former slave owner tries to physically abuse somebody, there were people from the North who went to the South to help set up schools, right? Because you had a public education system that was starting in the North. There was no public education in the South, right? 95% of slaves are illiterate, and a lot of poor white Southerners have never been to a school. Set up hospitals, right? Mediate between former slave owners and their slaves about how much they should get paid. You think about, you have a wealthy slave owner who owns 200 slaves, right? And we're talking about generations of physical abuse, sexual abuse, of making money off of these people who aren't getting paid. I mean, it might seem fair to just take that person's land and give it to the slaves, right? Slaves had value as property. Does anyone know how much, if you took all these slaves, 3.5, 4 million, how much money they were all worth together? In 1860, not today's, $3 billion. In 1860 dollars, $3 billion. It was the largest concentration of wealth, and they were owned by a small group of people. Like 4% of white Southerners owned 20 or more slaves. 13th Amendment is $3 billion worth of property is taken from wealthy slave owners already. They've already lost $3 billion worth of property. So yeah, so that's one of the reasons there's no land reform. One reason is that the slaves themselves were worth so much, it was already a big deal. It was already a huge loss of property. Second, if you take a large plantation that's growing cotton, right? There's this need that if someone has like 10,000 acres of land and they're a huge slave owner, produce cotton, massive amounts of cotton. If you divide up that land and give it to slaves, they might grow some cotton. So they'll grow maybe a little corn, they'll have like a vegetable garden, maybe they'll grow some cotton, but it'll disrupt this global economy, there's a global market. The idea of like taking land from people and giving it to basically poor people, right? Taking land from wealthy people, redistributing it amongst the more poor elements of that society, slaves in this instance, is something that doesn't really happen until the 20th century, right? When you have communist revolutions, various communist revolutions. China is a very good example. So this is basically like things that the federal government's doing, right? There's some people that think, hey, land redistribution, take land, and that doesn't really happen. But slavery does end with the 13th Amendment. The Freedmen's Bureau is set up to help set up schools, eventually try to guarantee the right to vote for former slaves, mediate this new society, right? Because For the slaves themselves, there are three really important things: family, church, and school. What do I mean with families? When it says families, what does that mean? Families was important for slaves. To reunite, right? Children, husbands, wives that had been sold and maybe were in separate states because they weren't actually under slavery. If your child was sold to another plantation and you don't know where they are, in Southern life with slavery being legal, that wasn't your son, that wasn't your daughter. That was somebody else's property, right? Marriages were not legally recognized. You're not a wife, you're not a husband, you're not a father. You have no legal guardianship over any of your family members, right? Because at the end of the day, you are somebody's property. There were laws that set up early on that protected wealthy slave owners when they committed sexual assault against female slaves, right? Where they would slaves would be raped, there would be children produced from that rape, and those children would be considered property of the slave owner. Even though, and we're talking about someone who's the biological father, and they're living in some slave quarters. They're not recognized as his children, but everyone basically, knows. I mean, you can imagine that kind of situation if you're in a slave marriage, you're the husband of a slave, and your wife, who's a slave, is sexually assaulted and gives birth to the child of the owner. What are you gonna do? You can't do anything. You can't sue the guy. You can't shoot him. It's illegal for you to own a gun, right? You have no legal recourse whatsoever. It happened. Sometimes it happened. Slaves would, female slaves would fight back, or in various instances. But you would end up having to run away. Or when it comes to families, this is a statement from chapter 15. Freed women had withdrawn from field labor. There was this huge reaction by white Southerners too. But there used to be so many women in the fields. Where all the former female slaves go? Where did black women go to? They all disappeared, right? They're all fulfilling a domestic role that they had been rejected to them. For the very first time, they get to be mothers. They get to be wives, and it's legally recognized. It's not, well, you're my property. I let you get married. I let you have kids, but you're working for me 12, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. And if you go home and you actually do things that we identify as traditionally motherly duties or family duties, it's because I let you, right? See what I'm saying? So for the first time, there's a legal recognition of, no, we have protection over our wives. They are going, and the idea of removing women from the direct supervision of white men, white overseers, right? I mean, essentially, you think about it, there's a lot of dialogue about this in the news, off and on about the idea of domestic violence or sexual assault, stuff like that, right? In the military, in civilian life, and it's something that's an issue today. When there's all sorts of groups and there's news networks that cover it, and Rolling Stone magazine does the thing, and there's protests and there's ribbons and there's all sorts of. I mean, there's still massive problems surrounding this, right? Where starting with the issue of rape and stuff like that. But imagine living in a society like the South before the Civil War, where there's no legal recourse for raping a slave. Like, you're not going to get punished, right? If you're the slave owner, you're not going to get punished. If a child is produced from that rape, you can just own them. That's someone you're going to get to own for the rest of their lives. It's like free. It's like an investment. It's almost an investment, And there's no legal recourse. So it's something that happened quite often, right? Thomas Jefferson, he had 5 children with one of his slaves, which their relationship was more. I mean, this is another thing too. People like they had a consensual relationship. Well, how is it really consensual if one person is the other person's property? And the church is very important. The black church is very important. It's the only really independent, it's the only really autonomous black institution into the 20th century, right? This is very important because if you look at the civil rights movement, once you, about a century after this, when there's still issues of voting rights and discrimination, right? You have a civil rights movement. Who's the main civil rights leader guy who had the dream? MLK, Martin Luther King, Reverend Martin Luther King. He's a minister, right? And the organization that led a lot of the early civil rights struggles in the 50s and early 60s was called the Southern Christian Leadership Coalition, right? They were pastors and ministers, they depended on other black people. Black people would come to the church, they pass the hat around, right? They donate money, and that's what a minister would live on. As opposed to somebody who might be a business owner that would rely on white customers. And if they started speaking about how they wanted the right to vote, or they thought segregation was wrong, a lot of those white customers might go away, right? And their livelihood would be threatened. So the black church is a very important thing. And it's still a very, in many ways, an important thing. And school, education, right? Education, land. Slaves want land, but also reuniting families, establishing their own churches, education, right? Getting an education, learning how to read and write, and also voting rights become a major thing. Voting rights are big, right? These are main issues that everybody goes for. We want to vote. We want a political voice. We want our own churches. We want our own families. We want our own cultural independence. We want our own political rights, and then land. We want economic rights also.